On November 16th of 2004, 64-year-old Mitra Simjanos had disappeared after visiting a meat market in her hometown of Kashava, North Macedonia. Just less than 2 months later, on January 12th of the following year, police found her dead body. She had been strangled, bound, tortured, and violated, but had only been dead for about 2 weeks, meaning she'd been kept prisoner somewhere and continually tortured for quite some time. Almost 3 years later, in November of 2007, 56-year-old Bitsela Kaska disappeared while walking almost the exact same route as the murdered Mitra. She too was found early the following year, having received very similar treatment to Mitra. Then, May of 2008, 65-year-old Zivaza Tamil Kaska received a call saying that her son had been hospitalized. She disappeared on her way to the hospital, and it was later revealed that her son was in picture-perfect health. Her body was found a few days later. Unlike the previous 2 victims, she had been bound with telephone cords before being tortured, violated, and strangled. Macedonia police were reportedly mystified by the murders, and there was a complete lack of cooperative forensic evidence at the scene, meaning the killer had no previous convictions, and the only connections between the 3 women was that they were all employed as cleaners for a collection of different temp agencies. Aside from that, there was no motive, no evidence, and no way of knowing who the killer might be. It most certainly made for an interesting case, and as word spread among the people of Kishavel that they had potential killer in their midst, panic began to set in. The murders had also gained the interest of a 56-year-old journalist named Vlado Tanaski, a veteran reporter who spent his career at 2 of Macedonia's most prestigious newspapers, and Milana began his own private investigation into the murders, detailing his work in a series of articles that were published in the likes of Nova Macedonia and Nutrinsk Vink. The Macedonia public were gripped by the articles, and for a while, it seemed as if Vlado might actually uncover the identity of the man they called the Kidshare Vault Monster. To them, Blanco was a hero, with the articles turning him into a national sensation and reviving what had been a floundering career. But it was during a read of one of the articles that a Macedonia homicide detective noticed something strange. Indeed, the articles were superbly written and pinpoint accurate. Yet to the detective, they seemed a little too good. Vlado was privy to a level of detail that could only have come from actually reading the case files, and sharing such documents with a journalist constituted either gross incompetence or possible corruption amongst the presiding officers. An extensive investigation was undertaken, but the source of the leak couldn't be found. In fact, informal security surrounding the investigation was positively airtight. And that's when it occurred to one officer that there was a second explanation to why Vlado knew so much about the murders. One they had to explore, no matter how unthinkable it was. In January of 2008, Vlado received a visit from a pair of homicide detectives who wished to discuss his articles with him. He was only too happy to answer their questions, believing his work was actually helping them catch the killer. And in a way, that's exactly what happened. Because when the police asked Vlado how he knew that the killer had used telephone cord to find his victims, the journalist fell silent. It was explained to him that only the investigating detectives were aware of this piece of information, and unless he could point the finger at the collaborating officer, Vlado had some serious explaining to do. When he failed to account for where such knowledge had come from, the police asked him to provide a DNA sample for use in the ongoing investigation. They assured Vlado that it would be used to rule him out of the investigation, and then, if he had nothing to hide, he had nothing to worry about. But Vlado did have something to hide, because when law enforcement compared Vlado DNA to a sample taken from the victim's corpse, it came back a match. The police had finally discovered the identity of the Kashava monster and was flooded with Jinsky himself. Following the Vlado arrest, the police built up a picture of the man whose sharp the client had driven him to violent insanity, and the 18 months before the first murder took place, Vlado's father had taken his own life. His mother accidentally overdosed on prescription medication, and he was laid off from his job. On top of that, he and his wife apparently separated when she moved to the Macedonia capital of Skopje. Police then moved to search the Tenacity's family's holiday home, a cottage in the countryside that they often summer. That it was there, the police uncovered a huge cache of adult material, ropes, and cords, which they used to tie the victims, and items belonging to the women Vlado had killed. Yet in a bizarre twist, police also discovered that Vlado's mother had been employed as a cleaner for most of her adult life, the same profession shared by his victims. This made for an extremely chilling addendum to the investigation, opening up the possibility that Vlado had suffered a complete mental break and had targeted the women because they resembled or even smelled like his mother. The salsa suggested that he'd had a fraught relationship with her, something his wife and friends said they were almost totally unaware of. Macedonia police were also planning on questioning Vlado regarding the disappearance of 73-year-old retired cleaner Gorsia Pavleshi, which had occurred on May of 2003. But following his transfer to Tetovo prison, Vlado was found dead in his prison cell on June 23rd. He had apparently drowned himself in a plastic bucket of water, his only means of taking his own life. It was an anticlimactic end to a story that had rocketed Macedonia society. The idea that a man was so desperate for the respect and admiration of his peers that he would literally kill for it, and that somehow, in the course of his violent campaign of murder and deception, he ended up targeting women that reminded him of his own mother. The lockdown was definitely something that changed a lot of things everywhere, and with changes everything was being revolutionized to online, and with a lot of desperate men being constricted to their closed walls, there were things that the men craved, and the main source of that thing became OnlyFans, and it boomed like the Zoom video app, and people were crazily invested into the app and getting the thing they paid for, and it became the large thing for such creeps that were able to get into profile of these girls and creep their way in. And such case was that of Cat West, and this case was big. It is not every day that you find a naked body face down in your neighborhood. With almost no helpful clues and a mystery murderer still on loose, nobody knew the direction this case was going. There was the OnlyFans and a regular clue. With life out and open on social media, and with sites like OnlyFans, even though they are proving itself to be revenue-generating sites for some, it is also a dangerous haven for creepers who are making intimacy a commodity, and thus able to act upon their urges that were rather repressed. And some are going to even greater extent to act upon these urges, and in turn, raising a concern about the safety of women working there. Cat West's lifeless body was found outside Calarina, Alabama by a neighbor who saw the body nude lying on the street. Was a kind of case that doesn't stop. This story was something that people in the news wanted to get their hands on. This was not very normal for the place and was getting every bit of exposure. There was nothing much on the case, and only thing that was different about the case was a bottle of absinthe tilted on the phone, and that was the only clue for probably a thing different about it. The police looked into the case, and it seemed to do with OnlyFans. A dead Cat West and her husband Jeff West. This was a very complicated case, with no evidence and no clues, just the endless parade between one dead Cat West, her husband Jeff, and an OnlyFans page, where her life was exposed in its natural naked form. Cat West was one of those extroverted women who would put their whole life on the social media to be seen by all, and now with OnlyFans, it wasn't just out there, it was out there, and it was more intimate than it usually is. When her body was found naked in the streets, the first suspicion that was raised on Jeff, her husband, and the first odd thing that they noticed was his reaction to her death, which was very calm and poised. But there was the history of him being in the army, so the calm posture wasn't really a big mystery, since everyone almost knows the things soldiers go through are much worse than we can imagine. So even though Jeff was arrested, many officials didn't really believe that he would do that. Even Kat's friends said that he would never do that. So the next on suspicion were the countless number of people on her OnlyFans, and this was something that could have been the reason. She was putting herself out in the open. Her sexual content was out in the open for a lot of people to see, and there is no doubt that how many creepers might have been on there waiting to prey on her. Could be any of the OnlyFans guys who might have confronted her in an alleyway or a street and then stalked her and killed her. One scenario could be that maybe the husband had enough of her lewd shoots and then kill her. But there was no hint of jealousy in Jeff, so police already ruled out that possibility. According to the judges who sentenced Jeff 16 years in prison for the murder of Kat West, this happened. One day, when Kat and Jeff were out, Jeff must have confronted Kat about the OnlyFans thing. "You keep posting those pictures on the internet," must have said Jeff. "It is not putting a very nice impression to the world out," he continued. "You know how people might see you," Jeff said. And as he said all this, she might have ignored him, and Jeff, being an army, possessed the skills necessary to kill a man. And then, the innocent-looking Jeff must have, in the moment of heat, turned into this barbaric devil, with his eyes red and raged, and took the absinthe bottle and hit her in the head with great power to kill her. Even though Jeff pleads innocent, even after 3 years of his wife's death, there is still a lot of speculation and missing facts. Jeff said that it was just a drunken accident, but we can never really be sure who and what killed her. Only if Kat could come back and tell us who killed her, Jeff or OnlyFans. We are not sure that if the verdict was right, if it was the vengeful angry husband or just a mere drunk accident, but there could be more to this case than just these two assumptions. We cannot ignore the fact of the sinister creep that are behind these screens, buying intimate shots of these women, obsessing over their bodies, and pushing to rather calm the urges they feel. This is not much in the open other than the husband, who is trying to plead not guilty and is fighting for his innocence. Even though they were an odd couple, there was no motive or reason for his husband to act so irrationally. So was it Jeff? Was it the accident that he claims? Or is it something more than what it seems to be? Is there a creeper who just got away with murder of the now deceased OnlyFans model, Kat West?
To say that James Rupert's upbringing was rough would be quite the understatement. Born on April 12th of 1934, his mother Charity had told him from a very early age that she would have preferred having a daughter as her second child, giving him the distinct impression that he was unwanted. Leonard, his father, treated him no better. The family was frequently terrorized by a man whose lack of patience gave way to a violent temper, and he showed his two children very little affection. Yet neither would be given the chance to reconcile, as Leonard died in 1947 when James was just 12 years old. After his father's death, James's older brother, Leonard Jr., became the family patriarch, and to his younger brother's horror, Jr. mimicked his late father's cruel and mocking behavior, often taunting James for being, as he put it, a weakling. By the time he was a young adult, James's awful home life meant that he already had one failed attempt at taking his own life under his belt. He stood at a meager 5'5", weighed just 135 pounds, and was described as a modest, bookish, and helpful young man who was unremarkable and quiet. As a result, for his shy demeanor, James never once got into any trouble with the law and lived most of his life as a law-abiding citizen. But by 1975, the fraternal love James felt towards his brother was wearing thin, and the envy he felt over Leonard Jr.'s successful career and loving family was beginning to boil over. James had dropped out of college after only 2 years, and by the time 1975 came around, he was unemployed, unmarried, and was still living at home with his mother. On the other hand, Leonard Jr. had earned himself a degree in electrical engineering, owned his own home in Fairfield, Ohio, and had 8 children. But what's more, the woman that Jr. had married was none other than James's own ex-girlfriend, Alma. At first, James simply took this in stride, but then again, Jr. was fond of reminding him of it, how she had been right not to marry a weakling such as he. On top of that, James's relationship with his mother didn't seem to have improved over the years. Charity was sick and tired of James's apparent inability to hold a steady job, and blasted him for having to self-medicate with alcohol, telling him he was unable to pay the rent, then she'd kick him out onto the street just like any other tenant. Obviously, living through such an unbearable situation took a terrible toll on James's mental health, and by the mid-70s, he found himself battling a deep and unshakable depression as he got closer and closer to the breaking point. He seemed deeply vexed and even mentioned how troubled he was to a 28-year-old waitress named Wanda Bishop. The mother of 5 would later state how, during one of her shifts at the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, James had told her of his growing frustrations with his mother's demands on him, of his impending eviction, and how he desperately needed to solve both problems. James stayed at the bar until it closed at 2:30 a.m. on Easter Sunday. But by that time, he didn't need to do any more thinking. He had decided on a permanent solution to his woes. Around noon on Easter Sunday of 1975, Leonard Jr. packed his wife and 8 children into his car and drove over to their grandparents' house. When they arrived, James was still upstairs in his bedroom, sleeping off a hangover after his long night of drinking, and was only roused by the sounds of children hunting Easter eggs on the front lawn. He groggily put on some pants and a bathrobe, and then went downstairs to greet his family for what would turn out to be the final time. It was just before 4 p.m. when James walked into the family kitchen. His mother was preparing dinner with the aid of both Leonard Jr. and his wife Alma, while the children played in the TV room. Leonard detected his brother's presence before he'd even turned to look at him and made some derisive comment about having slept all afternoon. But when Leonard finally did set eyes on his brother, what he saw made him freeze up in horror. Leonard stood there, eyes bloodshot, hair a mess, pointing a loaded .357 Magnum at his terrified brother. It was the last thing he would ever see. With the barrel aimed squarely at his brother's face, James pulled the revolver's trigger, sending a chunk of lead smashing into Leonard's skull at supersonic speed. His head just about exploded, sending a spray of carbon soup all over his nearby wife. She tried to scream, but James shot her in the head before the sound could ever escape her throat. Her mother simply watched, immobilized with fears. James then turned the gun on her, too. Alarmed at the loud noises coming from the kitchen, 3 of James's nephews and nieces came running to the kitchen to see what was going on. The hellish scene that greeted 11-year-old David, 9-year-old Teresa, and 13-year-old Carol was enough to send them into a frenzy of terrified screams which James didn't hesitate in silencing with shots from his .357. James then walked into the TV room where the execution style of killing devolved into something considerably more frenzied and fear-soaked. One child was shot in the chest, but the remaining children were shot as many as 3 times each, evidence that they had attempted to flee as James emptied his chambers, reloaded, then continued firing on his own young family members. Within 5 minutes of James waking up and walking downstairs, his entire immediate family was dead by his own hand. He then called the police to tell them what he'd done, sat down on the couch, and simply waited for the authorities to arrive. The shocking brutality of the killings rocked the small town in which they occurred. Many who were familiar with James Rupert thought him to be incapable of such violent acts and didn't even know that he owned a gun. People were stunned to hear of the hateful tensions that simmered underneath the surface, as by all accounts, the Rupert family were considered a perfectly pleasant and well-adjusted bunch. The very same day he was arrested, James was charged with 11 counts of aggravated homicide. Yet in sharp contrast to his initial cooperation, he refused to participate in any kind of interview. One of the few things James actually said to the arresting officers was that he intended to plead insanity and would escape any kind of punishment, since no jury in the land would find him guilty of murder once they'd heard his story. But the only story that grabbed anyone's attention was the horrific level of violence at the crime scene. County Prosecutor John Holcomb stated that there was so much blood on the first floor of Rupert's home that it was dripping through the floorboards and into the basement. Just over a year later, the house was open to the public and all of its contents were auctioned off. It was then cleaned, recarpeted, and rented to a family new to the area whose members were unaware of the murders that had taken place there. Other families had moved in and out, and the house was frequently occupied, but some complained that there were still bloodstains in the wooden floorboard of the TV room. One family even vacated the house entirely, claiming that they were hearing voices and other explained noises. At his trial, a jury found James Rupert guilty on all 11 counts of murder and sentenced him to 11 consecutive life sentences. Just as he'd promised, James appealed on the grounds that he was insane, and in 1982, defense attorney Hugh D. Holbrook personally funded the hiring of expert psychiatrists and psychologists from all over the country in a bid to prove his client was unfit to stand trial. But thankfully, a judge saw through the act. James was ruled sane, and the life sentences upheld. Rupert remains incarcerated in the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, and has since been denied parole by the prison board. James's next hearing is set for February of 2025, when he will be 90 years old. By that point, James Rupert will have spent more of his life inside a cell than outside of one, and it's doubtful that a 90-year-old man will be able to properly enjoy his final years of freedom. But then again, maybe that's a small measure of justice, since the man stole the life, love, and liberty of 8 of his young relatives. James only narrowly avoided the death penalty for his crimes, so maybe it's only right that he die in prison, where child killers like him most definitely belong.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
My name is Ali. I'm 33, and from the ages of 19 to 23, I was addicted to heroin. How I got hooked is a story on its own, but I have a better story to tell here, and that's how I got clean. I say better story, but it's still not a good one. In fact, it's actually pretty horrifying. But it was what I needed to get clean, so silver linings, I guess. Anyway, about 18 months into my addiction, I got kicked out of my apartment, and my family didn't want anything to do with me. I really can't blame them. So I ended up out in the streets. I was 21, 5'2", and 110 pounds soaking wet, so needless to say, I was pretty vulnerable. I think I'd have been more scared if I wasn't focused on scoring all the time. That's scoring drugs, not, But as you can imagine, life for a young woman out on the streets is not a good one. And Jesus Christ, is it scary. So first thing you learn is that you need protection. Basically, and as a feminist I hate to say this, you need a man. Now, I was lucky. Most girls don't get a choice, but I happened to hook up with a guy who had been an addict for about the same time as me, who was only a few years older. We didn't just get together so it'd be easier to score. We actually liked each other, and after a while, I'd say we fell in love. We spent the next 2 years together, just trying to get by, occasionally trying to kick the habit and facing all the hardships that came with the lifestyle altogether. Together, that was the important thing. It was the only thing that mattered. But I can't quite bring myself to type his name for a number of reasons, and you're about to learn the main one real soon. So this guy would do anything to protect me, and I mean anything. He stole from me, hurt people for me, but only when I needed to be defended. We were each other's whole worlds. And when we got 3 months in county for his 3rd shoplifting offense, he had an immaculate record before his addiction. I missed him like I've never missed anyone else, not even my whole family. I want to say that I was able to make it by without him, but that's not the case. And when he finally got released, I literally wept with joy. I was so happy to see him. The cops had forced him to get clean in the county, and the first thing he wanted to do when he got out was get high again. Luckily, I'd planned a little homecoming party in advance, which consisted of nothing more than a 10-bag of dope. So, we quickly found a safe, quiet place to nod out, then started spiking up. He went first, then shot up the second half of the needle, and we fell asleep in each other's arms. Something I'd missed so much I can barely find the words to describe. The last thing I remember is him trying to pull away from me, and I figured it was to go pee or something. I'd missed him so much that all I remember is tugging at his sleeve, not wanting to let him go. I'd waited months for that cuddle, and he could wait a minute longer. Just a minute longer. The next thing I know, I'm opening my eyes and I can still feel the guy's arm around me. You know when you just wake up and it's like you're not fully logged in yet? That's 1,000 times worse when you're on dope. Like it was actually like, huh? Who is this? Before a second before I remembered my man was out. So naturally I feel this warm, fuzzy feeling. I wiggle back into him and I pull his arm tight around me. Then I reach for his hand to lace my fingers between his like he always used to like. And it's cold. Not just October in Chicago cold, like I need a pair of gloves cold, stone cold, the kind of cold that made me realize something was horribly wrong. I barreled out from under him, spun around, tried to shake him awake, but it was no good. I remember I screamed so hard that I puked, and that caused someone to come running to check on us. After that, I'm not sure how long, the cops and the EMTs showed up, and I had to answer a bunch of questions. It was OD, by the way, in case you were wondering. He just shot a little too much after being clean for a few months, and his tolerance had plummeted so much that, yeah, his body just gave out. The worst thing is, though, as he was overdosing, he obviously tried to get away to get himself help or something. That's what the tugging must have been. A minute later, he must have slipped away unconscious. All the while I was cuddled up, all snug in his arms. I slept with his corpse for maybe 5 or 6 hours, and that's something I still think about, usually at least once a day. I think about my addiction, how grateful I am to be clean, and that's the first thing to pop into my head. I can't type his name because it just tears me up inside, like it's the most triggering thing for me, so please forgive me that I'd neglect such an obvious little detail. I can't type his name because, even though we were addicts, I loved him with all my heart. I loved him, and in some ways I feel like I killed him. He was clean. I brought him the shot that killed him. It's my fault. It's all my fault. And that's something that I'll never, ever get over.